Thank you, Bruce. Now I just have to do my best not to get how God is already in the midst of communicating with us this morning. So the gospel reading this morning is kind of like episodic television. It repeats the last verse that we read last week and then continues on this morning. Jesus, as we remember last week, was in the synagogue in Nazareth for the first time in reading the scrolls, the prophecy from Isaiah. And in verse 21 he says, "Then he began to say to them, 'Today this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing.'" And then we're told that everybody that was gathered there all spoke well of him and were amazed at the gracious words that came from his mouth. So it was a successful church service. They said, "Is this not Joseph's son?" So it was a great service. It seems that God has moved. And then they get back to the refreshment hour. And the story continues. So Jesus said to them, "Doubtless you will quote to me this proverb, 'Doctor, cure yourself.'" So I'm not aware of everything that was going on here. And with all due respect to Jesus, I don't hear anybody asking that or quoting that proverb in that passage. Do you? So Jesus is pressing a little bit, putting words in these good folks' mouth. It's like Jesus wasn't satisfied with what had taken place so far. Jesus wasn't satisfied that everybody was happy, and so he presses a little bit, and he causes some tension, and he does a little chastising and a little criticizing, which, as you can imagine, causes some tension in this group that's gathered. Now, I don't know all of why Jesus or why the Lucan community that developed this gospel felt the need to cause that tension. Maybe if we take the story at face value, Jesus feels the need just to press a little bit and to cause some tension and to get folks to think about things. That's entirely possible. There's other dynamics and other agendas going on, and as most of us are experienced enough in the ways of the world to know, there's always other dynamics and other agendas that were going on. Something new to me that I discovered this week is that there was a little hometown rivalry between Nazareth and Capernaum amongst the early followers of Jesus. So Jesus, born in Nazareth, for whatever reasons, chose to begin his ministry and kind of have the home base for his ministry in Capernaum. And Nazareth was a little bit upset about that. It would be like if a great spiritual leader arose from our ranks here and went down to Del Rey and began their ministry down there and kind of ignored their hometown of Lake Worth. And then, of course, it's what's important for us to remember that the Gospels weren't a first-hand account of the stories that were taking place. They were written many decades later. They were birthed out of the spiritual communities, the churches that were formed by the followers of Jesus. And so those churches were within Judaism, and they were breaking away from Judaism. So there was a little bit of tension there as well. And at worst in the Gospels and in the Christian writings, that borders on anti-Semitic. In breaking away, it was very important for them to criticize what was taking place within the Jewish religion. So there's a little bit of that as well. That's not as important as the fact that there was tension in this place. And I think the story is instructive for us as to where tension comes from. And how do we handle tension with one another when it comes up? Tension comes from all different places. You know, sometimes we have great intentions of sharing information and advice, and it just comes out in a way that folks can't hear it. Have you ever experienced that? And not saying that's what happened with Jesus, but here's a relatively new, 30-year-old, rather young preacher trying to convey some truth, and sometimes it comes out in ways that are just difficult to accept, difficult to hear, and difficult to understand. And of course, we all have different personalities, don't we? We have different ways of seeing the world and being in the world. And so some of us have taken the Enneagram as a helpful way to understand that, because we interrelate differently. So, for example, if somebody's an 8 in the Enneagram, someone that's kind of large and in charge and likes to get things done, is very helpful in getting things done, and they're working together with me, someone that's a 6 that has a love-hate relationship with authority and kind of gets nervous and anxious and fearful about things, there's going to be some friction as the two of us work together. There's going to be some tension. Sometimes there's tension because of what's going on in us, and hopefully we're always growing and we're always learning new things and coming into a larger understanding of God and of the world. And sometimes when that happens, there's tension inside us that sometimes spills out into and onto others in the course of our life together. Sometimes there's things that we see happening in the world that we have strong values about, and an understanding that this isn't the way that things should be. And we feel the call, and we feel the responsibility to say something about that and to do something about that. The problem is that those systems that now allow those injustices and inequities to happen are very beneficial to other people. So when somebody says something and somebody rocks the boat, there's some tension there, even amongst friends and families and colleagues. And then so many times, we just see things differently from one another, don't we? We look at the news and we interpret it differently. We see what's going on in the world and we have different understandings of why those things are happening. There are things that we want to see improved and that we want to see better, and we can agree on that, but so often we disagree on the best way to get that done, don't we? And so that causes tension between us. And so most of us, most of the time, especially folks like us, because we're such nice people, we don't want to deal with that tension. You know, so we walk away from it, or we run away from it and don't want to deal with it. But we see in Jesus, and we see in the crowd, a couple of different ways of dealing with tension, don't we? So Jesus is having this conversation. Jesus is preaching to the folks that were stupid enough to stay around for donuts that day. And they're saying, you all got this all wrong. You had the prophets, you had Elijah, you had Elisha that preached to you. And look what they did. Elijah was with the widow. And so the widow wasn't a Jewish believer, and yet God chose to work mightily through her. And look at Elisha and the king Naaman who had leprosy and came to Elisha and said, what do I do? Elisha said, you do this. And then Naaman was cured from his leprosy. So these are people that aren't part of your club, aren't part of your faith tradition, and yet God chose to work mightily through them. And so these folks were getting angrier and angrier and angrier until what did they do? They ran Jesus out of town. They chased him out of town and ran him to the edge of a cliff and were threatening to throw him off. Now, I'm not a therapist or a psychologist, but I think most would tell us that's really not an appropriate way for us to handle our anger and to handle tension. And yet so often, sometimes literally in this day and age, and so many times metaphorically, that's how we handle tension, isn't it? It builds and builds and builds until we say no more. And then we attack one another, either with words or sometimes with more harmful and even lethal actions. Could there be a better way? Look at how Jesus handles the tension. They run him to the edge of the cliff, and then what does Jesus do? Jesus simply walks through the crowd and goes on his way. Sometimes that's the best way to handle tension. So if it's getting pretty heated, and especially if we fear for our safety, we fear what might happen if we engage this other, if we give in to that tension, sometimes the best thing to do is just to walk away from it, to walk away from the tension, to rise above it, if that's a helpful way of defining it for us, and just to walk away. That is a valid and it's a sometimes necessary way to handle tension. But I think there's a third way. So maybe we don't attack the tension as those in the crowd did. Maybe if we're feeling safe, we don't do what Jesus did and just walk through the crowds and away from the tension. Maybe we take the risk of being with the tension. Sometimes tension is helpful. Many times tension is necessary. The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who wrote a letter from his jail cell to pastors during the time of desegregation and the fighting for rights for African Americans. And I know most of us are familiar with that letter, but what happened was Martin Luther King was arrested for his protests, and the religious leaders in Birmingham got together and wrote a letter that said, you know what, you're doing great work, and we agree with you. You're right, things need to change. But Reverend King, things need to change a little bit more slowly. This is getting too tense. This is getting uncomfortable. Things are moving too fast for people. Can you just lay low for a little while? And the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King wrote his famous letter from a Birmingham jail. In response to that letter, just an incredible piece of spiritual justice literature. And listen to what he has to say. I must confess that I am not afraid of the word tension. I have earnestly opposed violent tension, but there is a type of constructive, nonviolent tension which is necessary for growth. You see, we can attack those with whom we're tense. We can walk away from the tension, or we can choose a path of growth and learning and to sit with the tension, to pay attention to how we feel about how we're feeling, and to hear those that have different ideas or different ways of being than we do. G.I. Gurdjieff was a spiritual teacher in the first half of the 20th century, and he became kind of trendy, and people would flock to him to be taught by him, kind of the Deepak Chopra of his era. And so people would come and they would gather, and Gurdjieff would teach them, and they would live and work together in community. And in one specific community in Paris that Gurdjieff was leading, there was this old guy there who nobody liked. He was part of the community, but he was just cantankerous and grouchy, would never do his share of the work that needed to be done. And the rest of the group, they just didn't like being with him. And so this gentleman finally left the group. Said, I'm not going to be part of this group anymore. And of course, for the rest of the folks, there was a great deal of relief about that. But you know what Gurdjieff did? He went and found him and said, hey, we need you to come back. The guy said, I'm not coming back. Why would I come back to that? I didn't enjoy it. Those people didn't like me. Why would I come back? And so then Gurdjieff said, well, you know what I'll do? I'm going to pay you to come back to the group. And so the guy said, well, that sounds like a good deal. Of course I'll come back. So the guy comes back to the group. The rest of the group found out that Gurdjieff was paying him to be there. And they said, hey, mister, what's this all about? We're paying you to be here, and you're turning around and giving this money to this guy to be here as well, and none of us like him. But you see, what Gurdjieff had realized is that there's learning and there's growth that can take place in the tension. He says, well, I don't know what you're complaining about. You're giving me your money to teach you, and I'm giving it to this guy so that he can teach all of us. There's growth that happens in the tension. Sometimes it's just paying attention to how we feel, and the things that rise up in us as we're with people that make us uncomfortable and that cause us tension. Sometimes it's we ourselves that need to grow. Somebody was telling me a story recently about someone that they were at odds with and didn't want to be around. They had an engagement where they needed to be together, and they didn't want to go there, but she did it. And she entered into communication and conversation with this person. She said, at the end of that conversation, I realized that I was the one that was wrong about this situation. Sometimes there's things going on below the line of our consciousness that need to bubble up, and tension can create that. So if I join the PTA at my kid's school because I tell myself that my agenda is to, help the school out and help the teachers out and help the students out and to do what I can to dig in, and somebody else is joining the PTA as well, and we end up on a committee together. But unbeknownst to me, there's some agendas that are below the surface, that I want some attention and I want some pats on the back and people telling me what a good job that I'm doing. And then somebody else joins in that work, and they're getting those pats on the backs and congratulations and the gratitude for the work that they're doing, and maybe I'm not. And so that bubbles up above that level of consciousness. This is what Thomas Keating, the monk, talks about when he talks about the possibilities that centering prayer bring us to be present to what's going on in our life. And so if I'm willing to be there in that tension, then I'm going to learn stuff about myself. Sometimes tension is necessary to get the work done. And so we practice having civil conversations with one another, nonviolent conversations with one another, to see if we can come to resolution. Sometimes in our work for justice, it becomes so angry and so shrill. And I'm always reminded of the passage from Ephesians 6:12. It's like just a great reminder. For our struggle is not against enemies of blood and flesh, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers of present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in heavenly places. So it's practice to engage in this work of discussing issues with compassion and love and dignity and respect with those that might disagree with us. I sat with someone, I think I've told this story before, Deb Kaiser Cross, who's a retired UCC clergy. And she said that her practice these days is to sit with somebody with whom she disagrees and ask them the question, what is the story that brought you to this place of feeling this way and thinking this way? Help me understand that. And that hopefully coming to that in a place of curiosity and questioning brings both of them to new levels of understanding. I think one of the most wonderful places that we can practice this is in our lives together as the church, united in mission, united in purpose, but not always agreeing with one another. Sometimes churches have been the absolute worst place for that. Some of us, not all of us, have had experiences in churches that have harmed us, that have caused us trauma, where we've been told either in words or in actions that we're not welcome here, that we're not invited to participate here. Just yesterday, a folk duo that I really like called the Bingmans had written a song, and we'll post this. I didn't want to play it because this is their livelihood, and they have their platforms, and I didn't want to just broadcast that to the tens of people that are listening this morning. But it's called The Hymn to the Traumatized Church. And just a few of the lyrics: when the worst come howling, when the congregation scowling, in the pews daggers at you, just think of the great Miami, the river there in the Midwest, not the city, washing through the church, and rest your head under the Red River birch. Sometimes in our relationship with our faith communities, it's best to walk away. But I think other times it's wonderful and nurturing and in a relatively safe place to sit with the tension that we sometimes feel, to learn from one another, to learn more about ourselves, to get better at the work that we do with one another. Not despite the tension, but because of the tension that we experience and practice together. Let's pray.